What if I told you that the first people of Australia were dark-skinned, and their ancestors had been living there for more than 60,000 years? So how did a country whose first inhabitants were Indigenous Australians become predominantly European? The answer begins in 1788, when Britain arrived with the first fleet, and what happened after that would completely transform Australia, and leave one of the darkest chapters in its history. For more than 60,000 years, Aboriginal peoples had lived across the Australian continent. And here's something important. There wasn't one single Aboriginal Australian group. Australia was home to hundreds of distinct Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups with their own languages, traditions, laws, and connections to country. So when we ask, were Australians black? The answer is more complicated than simply saying yes or no. The first peoples of Australia were Indigenous peoples with diverse appearances and cultures. But many Aboriginal Australians had dark skin, and their ancestors had occupied the continent for tens of thousands of years. In other words, Australia wasn't an empty continent waiting to be discovered. It already had people, and then Britain arrived. In 1770, Lieutenant James Cook claimed the east coast of Australia for Great Britain, but there was a massive problem. People were already living there. Britain's claim was based on the concept of terra nullius, essentially land belonging to nobody. British authorities treated Aboriginal societies as if they didn't possess the kind of political organization or land ownership recognized by British law. That meant Aboriginal people's existing relationship with their land was effectively ignored. Then came 1788. The first fleet arrived at Sydney Cove under Governor Arthur Phillip, 11 ships, convicts, marines, and officials, and the beginning of permanent British colonization. For the Eora people around Sydney, this wasn't the beginning of Australia, it was the beginning of a completely new and devastating chapter. The British settlement immediately created conflict. Why? Land, food, resources, and control. The Eora resisted the newcomers. One of the best-known resistance leaders was Pumulwuy, who fought against the colonial settlement around Sydney. And this wasn't isolated to Sydney. As Europeans expanded across the continent, Aboriginal groups resisted them in different regions. A.I. Atsis describes these conflicts as the Frontier Wars, spanning roughly from the 1780s into the 1920s. The violence wasn't one-sided in the sense that Aboriginal people simply accepted colonization. They fought back, but the colonial expansion brought enormous advantages in population, firearms, resources, and organized military and police forces, and Aboriginal communities suffered catastrophic losses. And here's where the story becomes even more complicated. Not everyone who died during colonization was killed in battle. European diseases also devastated Indigenous communities. One of the earliest and most devastating examples was smallpox around the Sydney region. The National Museum of Australia notes that thousands of Eora people died from European diseases. At the same time, settlers took land for farms, towns, and grazing. Traditional food sources were disrupted, people were pushed away from country, and violence accompanied this expansion. Across different parts of Australia, frontier conflict included killings and massacres. The exact number of Indigenous people killed during frontier violence remains debated by historians because records are incomplete. But there is no serious historical question that colonization involved widespread violence, dispossession, and enormous population loss. You might think the worst part ended once the frontier wars declined. It didn't. Instead, government control increasingly moved from direct frontier conflict to laws and institutions controlling Indigenous lives. Authorities created reserves and missions. They controlled where many Aboriginal people could live, where they could work, and increasingly what happened to their children. The word used was often protection, but protection could mean control. For example, in New South Wales, amendments to the Aborigines Protection Act in 1915 gave authorities extremely broad powers to remove Aboriginal children from their families. Similar policies existed elsewhere, and this created what we now call the stolen generations. Thousands upon thousands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were forcibly separated from their families. Some were placed in institutions, others were sent to white foster families or adopted, and many grew up separated from their language, culture, country, and relatives. There wasn't one single day when everything suddenly stopped. Australia gradually changed. Indigenous Australians fought for citizenship, equality, land rights, and recognition. The 1967 referendum became a major milestone in Indigenous rights. Although it is often misunderstood, it did not suddenly give Aboriginal people the right to vote. Then came one of the biggest legal turning points, 1992. The High Court handed down its decision in the Mabo case. For generations, Australian law had operated around the idea of terra nullius, but the High Court recognized that Indigenous Australians had existing rights to land land under their traditional laws and customs. Terra nullius was effectively exposed as a legal fiction. The following year, Australia passed the Native Title Act 1993. The legal system had finally recognized something Aboriginal peoples had known all along. Their connection to country didn't begin when Britain arrived. And then came another historic moment. In 1997, the Bringing Them Home report documented the history of forced child removals and made recommendations for reconciliation. For years, Australians debated whether the nation should formally apologize. Then, on the 13th of February 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered a formal apology to Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, particularly the Stolen Generations. Millions watched, but an apology couldn't undo centuries of dispossession. It couldn't return every lost childhood, and it couldn't restore every language or community that had been broken apart. It was a recognition of what had happened. So after more than 60,000 years of Indigenous history, was Australia stolen? The British arrived, claimed the land under the idea of terra nullius, took enormous areas of country, and displaced the people who already lived there. Indigenous Australians resisted, but thousands died from disease, violence, and dispossession, while government policies later separated children from their families. So was this simply colonization, or was it the theft of a land that already belonged to someone? You decide. Subscribe and like the video. Thanks for watching.